I'd like to just offer a few words of welcome. My name is Matthew Engelke. I'm the director of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life here at Columbia. And it's my pleasure to offer this introduction of Maggie Jones, who will be our moderator for this evening. Maggie will then go on to introduce our speakers for this evening. But Maggie is a lecturer at the University of Pittsburgh, where she teaches writing, and she's also a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. And one of the silver linings of having to postpone this event was the ability to bring Maggie into the conversation. She's written in several different venues and several different instances on the question of the connection between death and mourning and the practices around American deathways. But she had an absolutely beautiful and harrowing and moving piece in the New York Times Magazine last May on the ways in which death care workers in New York City largely were dealing with the very material challenges facing these most significant of our immaterial concerns with the questions of dignity. Dignity is an issue that sits at the heart of the work of our two speakers this evening in different ways, as do questions of design, which speaks to the title of this evening's event. But I will turn over now to Maggie so that she can introduce Karla and John. Let me just say before I go that one piece of kind of Zoom housekeeping. So Karla and John are going to speak to us for each about 20 to 25 minutes, and then they will engage Maggie in some conversation. Maggie will then take questions from you all. So there will be time at the end for your questions and reflections. You are very welcome, those of you in the audience, to post your questions at any point from now until the end of the evening at 7 p.m. in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So you should be able to see the Q&A link there. So please do feel free to use that at any point during this evening's event. So Maggie, I turn over to you, and John and Karla, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone else out there for joining us.
Thank you, Matthew. I really appreciate it. It's my great pleasure to be moderating this panel. And I'll introduce both Karla and John, and Karla will then present first. Karla is an architect, a professor, and a creative thinker. She is the founder and director of Death Lab, a transdisciplinary research and design initiative focused on reconceiving how we live with death in the city. Her areas of inquiry span the intimate spaces of urban life, death, and memory, to intersections of social justice and infrastructure. She's been a McDowell Fellow as design director of Leighton Productions and in teaching over a decade of studios at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. Karla engages with alternative and emerging methods of corpse disposal. As a member of Columbia's Seminar on Death since 2011, she's committed to the radical reshaping of urban public spaces, which enable us to better honor our dead. And in Karla's words, and I love these words, the rituals, she says, surrounding human death and the subsequent disposition of the corpse reflect the social character of the living. And then after Karla presents, we will have John Bruce give his presentation, and John is a researcher, strategist, and filmmaker. He's an assistant professor of design strategy at Parsons, where he also serves as director of the Transdisciplinary Design MFA program. His current projects and collaborations include researching and co-directing the documentary project and film End of Life, which he will be describing in his talk, and so I won't go into detail here. but it's quite thought-provoking and wonderful. He's also a strategist for the light phone, the simple phone that provokes reflection on our relationships with technology and our ability to be present. His work is informed through explorations of presence, proximity, temporality, participation, exchange, and more. His work has been exhibited recently at the New York Film Festival, the Pompidou Center, ICA London, and elsewhere. He also was a 2015-16 fellow at the Graduate Institute for Design, Ethnography, and Social Thought at the New School. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to Karla.
Thank you, Maggie. It's really wonderful to have you join us in this conversation this evening. And I look forward to hearing more of your thoughts on our work, both of our works. Matthew and Mariana, thank you for your perseverance to bring us together, and also for including this IRCPL event as part of the Reimagine End of Life Fall Festival. I will share my screen and you'll let me know if you can see everything the way we hope you do. I'm really delighted to finally meet John. We've been told by colleagues that we should know one another, and we know of each other's work, but it's really great to have our initiative adjacent to your work tonight. So as an architect, my academic and professional commitment to spaces of death and remembrance has been shaped by my interests in the margins of the city and the sometimes unlikely places where intimate and collective realms intersect. A couple of decades ago, I bumped into the cemeteries while exploring the edges of large urban infrastructures and other spatial and programmatic confluences that we sometimes unwittingly inhabit. Cemeteries quite literally embody the past, and this tethering to history and to our shared humanity prompted me to consider how we will keep communion with our dead in increasingly dense global cities where many cemeteries are rapidly running out of space, and also how design in this context can help amplify awareness and discussion of the shifting priorities and very complex predicaments of dense urban cities, including the maintenance of cemetery spaces and the reality of individual living conditions. It became evident early on that prevailing funerary and memorialization options are largely unsustainable and increasingly inadequate, particularly for dense cities and their diverse inhabitants. And the realities of the COVID-19 pandemic have set these issues into high relief. As we know, the numbers of the dead continue to mount, and the resolute members of the funerary industry have been among frontline workers across these 8 months. At times, many, indeed most all, customary rituals and trappings of the funeral were, or in many cases still are, no longer safe or feasible. In many instances, the ceremony, the funerary ceremony, has been distilled to the essence and the urgency of expression, words, emotions, and ephemerality. Susan Herman, who is a constitutional scholar and president of the ACLU, recently presented the 28th Amendment Project at the Brooklyn Public Library, where she said, "Crisis is a crucible of change." And I love this sentence and its stance, and I think that many of us want to believe that the current shifts in expectation and priorities are profound enough to catalyze and empower fundamental changes. And I don't mean solely in the funerary industry, positive and necessary corrections in many aspects of our lives. As architects, We believe that one of the core responsibilities of design is to critically engage complex and sometimes quite delicate realities, while optimistically guiding society's imagination and ability to work toward better futures. So Death Lab and many of my design studios have taken up the challenge of recalibrating the city's relationship with death, providing new scaffolds and civic sacred public spaces where a covenant between humanity and the natural cycles of the planet is affirmed, where grief of diverse definitions and scales and durations is supported, and where death is accepted as an essential and natural part of life. We understand death not as an epilogue adjacent to life, but rather as an integral aspect of our intertwined humanity and as a potent reminder of our stewardship responsibilities for the planet. To inform the work that we're doing, my graduate design and research studios have traveled to several global cities and engaged in a range of funerary rituals, religious customs, and other cultural expectations. We've studied both conventional and emerging methods of corpse disposition and the arrangements and distribution of urban funerary infrastructures, as well as the ecological consequences of these choices. And for those of you who aren't part of the study or the practice of architecture, the design studio for both students and professors alike offers a space of inquiry without formal boundaries. It's a place of collaborative exchange and individual growth that supports social, spatial, and material discovery. The atmosphere of the studio and the work that comes out of it pose important and often difficult questions with the intent of opening the horizons of speculation and possibility, rather than conforming to anticipated outcomes or preconceived expectations. Through our research in the lab and the exploratory environment of the studio, we're fostering original and meaningful investigations with respect to the program, the processes, the spatial potential, and the experience of new urban places for both disposition and commemoration. Obviously, as architects, design is in the DNA of everything we engage, but research and critical positioning are equally potent in this work and in design in general, which is why when I launched Death Lab in 2013 to focus on the intertwined future of life and death, I recruited colleagues from across Columbia's campus to join us in this quest. Because while the aim of our work is to amplify and to realize new public spaces of death and remembrance, this endeavor requires the expertise of many disciplines and perspectives. So in addition to architects, our team is comprised of associates from earth and environmental engineering, art history, sociology, philosophy, theology, biology, and anatomy, and of course, an amazing array of talented graduate students. Together, we're engaging a design challenge that is cultural and environmental, technical and emotional, individually intimate and socially impactful, humanist and urgent. In response to the realities of urban density, evolving preferences, values, and environmental cognizance, Death Lab's mission is to advance how we live with death in the city. We're exploring visionary and pragmatic design solutions to address social and infrastructural shortcomings of existing mortuary protocols. Our projects respond to diverse spiritual impulses, attending to both the disposition and the memorialization of the dead. Through innovative and ecologically responsible technology and design, we're working to augment public awareness, civic space, and civility within our cities. Our initial designs were intentionally ambitious provocations, bold interventions to instigate public conversation of an under-discussed territory and to catalyze future potential. We believe that critical visual imagination can instigate necessary scientific and social change. And our goal is to make these potentials reality, to both augment existing funerary spaces and to transform the urban landscape. So a quick overview of some of the contextual issues. In New York City, the dead already outnumber the living in both Queens and the Bronx. And from a global perspective, even when we're not struggling with a pandemic, over 100 people die each minute. That's over 150,000 deaths worldwide every day. Logically, as the human population continues to grow, the shortage of urban cemetery spaces becomes more severe. To make things even more complicated, in most of Manhattan, it's been illegal to perform an earthen burial for over 150 years. So presently, 2/3 of all New Yorkers who elect to be buried do so outside of the 5 boroughs. That's both for cost reasons and for the logistics of space no longer being available. This ostracizing of the dead perpetuates the social and spatial marginalization of death and denies urban residents the perspective and attentiveness that a consciousness of mortality can evoke. But the challenges are not just about spatial limits and proximity. Mainstream funerary practices are resource intensive with staggering amounts of chemical embalming fluid, heavy metals, hardwoods, and concrete literally consumed by US cemeteries. The typical casket itself is engineered to resist natural biodegradation, and once interred, all of these materials enveloping the corpse remain in the earth for generations. Cremation is presumed by many to be the sensible solution, but it too produces undesirable environmental impacts. Incinerating one water-heavy adult corpse requires approximately the same amount of energy as we utilize in our households each month. Although the process is spatially expedient, reducing the body to 4% of its mass, roughly. The consumption of fossil fuels here and trees elsewhere, each funeral pyre can consume up to 900 pounds of wood. Combustion of the deceased can't honestly be considered an environmentally positive act. And even in cultures where green burial has always been the norm, extreme measures are underway. In Jerusalem, at the Givat Shul cemetery on the border between Palestinian and Israeli territories, they've built both up and excavated down. A new network of tunnels 50 meters underground brings the dead into direct contact with Jerusalem's geological substrate. The $50 million first phase of this project, which is basically a modern catacomb, has added 22,000 vaults and is projected to accommodate just 7 years of Jewish burials. In Mumbai, Zoroastrian residents traditionally use dakma, or towers of silence, to lay out their dead in a natural process of excarnation, wherein the corpse is consumed by carrion birds. This 3,000-year-old ritual of sky burial avoids bringing the deceased in contact with earth or fire, both of which are considered sacred. Unfortunately, over the past 20 years, pollution and pharmaceuticals have decimated India's vulture population, and the birds became practically extinct in Mumbai. So a huge vulture aviary has been proposed, covering 2 of the 4 functioning dakma on Malabar Hill, to create an open air sanctuary for both the birds and this Parsi mortuary ritual. There is also a bit of greenwashing going on in the industry. where in a sleight of hand, companies package and veil the process of cremation as nurturing a tree or an entire forest. In reality, having been combusted, cremated remains have turned their organic origins into primarily CO2 and pollutants. And folks now also have the opportunity to spend up to $50,000 to compress the tiny bits of carbon remaining in the ash and bone fragments into a keepsake diamond. These post-mortem markets are cloaked in a patina of responsibility or honor. They certainly add comfort to some, but they also promote the perpetuation of unsustainable disposition practices rather than an honest reckoning with their consequences. An entreaty is swelling to redress unsustainable actions of the past. And we see our engagement with both death and environmental consequence as a means to strengthen social cohesion and accountability across generations. Our intent is to offer options at death commensurate with the principles we honor while alive, appreciating our body's literal connection to the earth and the stars, and engaging larger issues of legacy, resource depletion, energy allocations, dignity, and renewal. Shifts in thinking and action begin with understanding. The physical vessel that becomes our corpse is primarily comprised of oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus, each of which is common in nature, easy to reintroduce back into ecological cycles, and suitable to contribute to ongoing natural ecologies. Anaerobic bioconversion is a process where naturally occurring microorganisms break down biodegradable material in the absence of oxygen. When we die, some of the 100 million bacterial cells that live on and in us shift into an ecosystem of decomposition. Left alone over time, human tissue will basically dissolve. What really fascinates us is that the energy that is naturally released through anaerobic bioconversion can be harnessed and elegantly expressed. When we die, our body contains the latent energy to both fuel its own memorial and nourish the earth. And together with our partners at Columbia School of Environmental Engineering and with support from the Earth Institute and NYSERDA, we're developing a carbon neutral process using microbes to break down the organic matter of the corpse within an enclosed memorial vessel to resolve the body into its underlying nutritive elements and latent energy. Existing cemeteries in New York City comprise an aggregate gated area of more than 5 times the size of Central Park. While these vast necropolis provide valuable ecological habitat and are often incredible cultural repositories, even now they are lightly utilized as a public asset of the city, and they are dark at night. Afterlight memorials will enable these existing urban cemeteries to continue to serve their constituents indefinitely while amplifying access to civic open space and allowing the public to convene throughout the day and the evening. The glow of each afterlight vessel waxes during decomposition, eventually dimming at the end of the process, marking a transition in mourning, a reassertion of life, and readiness for the system to accept and honor another loss. The aggregate network instrumentalizes natural cycles of growth, decay, and renewal, regenerating a truly perpetual landscape, honoring the deceased. Gently enshrining space for death in everyday life, these illuminated networks will foster healthier relationships with mortality and remind us of our responsibilities to the past, the future, and each other. In 2017, our Sylvan Constellation project won the International Future Cemetery Competition. Lacing the verdant canopy of Arnosvale Cemetery in Bristol, England, Sylvan Constellation mediates between the Victorian spaces of memorial and the cosmopolitan city life outside the cemetery gates. The existing site topography and wildlife remain largely unmodified, but perforated by new spaces available to the public. Where space permits, the vessels are embedded in the earth, but the majority are lofted on slender steel pylons, creating a porous canopy in dialogue with the trees. On this site, 150 afterlight vessels have the potential to provide a practically endless burial ecosystem. The network will accept and honor new deaths in cyclical perpetuity and preserve far more woodland vegetation than traditional earthen burial plots. Sylvan Constellation supports the history of Arnosvale while also reinforcing and extending the diverse programming that already occurs in the cemetery, including weddings and children who traverse it as a daily shortcut to and from school. The networked afterlight strategy is scalable and adaptable to a variety of contexts, including engagement with existing urban infrastructures that are not cemeteries. Harnessing science while respecting spirituality, Constellation Park is a public memorial tethered to the vitality of the city. This civic sacred realm parallels the Manhattan Bridge deck with an elegant constellation of light, illuminating a new 24/7 humanist terrain in the city. In this scenario, grafting onto the underbelly of the bridge, 5,000 to 10,000 lives will be memorialized each year. Triangulated tensile steel cables support the convex memorials, which cradle the corpse throughout its biological conversion. Public pathways and clearings knit the multi-level territory into the life of the city, and individual morning lights powered by the bioenergy of the deceased materialize the ephemerality of remembrance. Semi-private sheltered spaces are nested amidst communal processions and large ceremonial areas that can host funerals, weddings, concerts, post-COVID gatherings, supporting diverse populations and purpose. The project accepts the physical finality of death while recognizing the transience of remembrance and the cyclical nature of organic life. Here, both intimate and communal aspects of grief are respected, but not cloistered. These spaces of remembrance will be defined by and continually fortified within the cycles and energies of urban life. While not yet unanimously embraced, society is increasingly aware of and accountable for the imprints being left on the planet. Reweaving the ubiquity of death into the fabric of our cities reminds us of humanity's interdependence with all life and the fragile responsibility the living share to fortify the future. Fortunately, we're not alone in this effort to engage the corpse on its organic basis. Natural burial is the most sensible option where proximate rural land exists, and the Green Burial Council is a great source of information on this. And in Seattle, Katrina Spade has founded a company now called Recompose, which utilizes aerobic, oxygenated, controlled decomposition to compost the corpse into the equivalent of 2 wheelbarrows of fortified soil. The Washington State Legislature legalized that process last year, and in 2020, Recompose has raised $6.75 million toward realizing their first facility. And this is incredibly affirming to us. The last thing that I'll quickly share, because I know that our time is short, are a couple of images from Death Lab, Democratizing Death. This was a solo exhibition that we mounted at the 21st Century Museum of Contemporary Art in Kanazawa, Japan. The 8-month installation included Death Lab's manifesto and mission, together with details of several of our design projects interviews, and research. Collectively, the exhibition demonstrated the power of design to resituate death into the rhythms of daily life, and through the voices of diverse experts, the readiness of cities to embrace these public spaces for the living. A large illuminated physical model evoked the atmosphere of the shifting constellations of memorial light. So just a few concluding thoughts. Our work engages fluid intersections of contemporary life, the specificities of place and community, and the unsteady states of memory. Through design and science, we can meaningfully scaffold mortality and construct enduring positive legacies. We can provide sustainable processes and physical spaces that invite return without possession in perpetuity. Accumulating palimpsests of life and memories, these spaces will endure while the physical ephemerality of the body is elegantly honored and allowed to dissipate. Friends and loved ones will have a place to return to that is a tribute to the deceased, a space for both grief and the celebrations of life. Design has the capacity to illuminate issues that have been overlooked, yet merit close attention. Design responds to vital human needs and gives structure to evolving cultural ritual. Civic spaces can uplift community and invite conversation among strangers while supporting necessary social recalibrations. Cultural imagination is shaped by what people see, feel, and discuss. It can foster responsive ideological exploration. Through dialogue, we will expand what is conceivable, opening fresh space to meet urgent needs. We are in an exceptionally complex time, perhaps a crucible of change. At Death Lab, we're honored to be part of advancing public conversations and real possibilities of post-death practices that sustain the human spirit and our civil stewardship of the present, the past, and the future simultaneously. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karla. I just want to say, having spent a fair amount of time reporting in different sort of death spaces, there are few, I don't think there's anything that's gotten me as excited as this work about death and thinking creatively and innovatively and with responsibility about how we treat the corpse and rituals around that. So thank you very much. And we'll have lots of questions, I'm sure. And now we'll turn it over to John.
Thank you, Karla. Wow, that was really rich, and I'm so grateful for your work. And I have so many questions of my own as well. Thank you for sharing. Really, really inspiring and beautiful in so many ways. Thank you, Maggie, for hosting us, facilitating us, and thank you, Matthew in Columbia, for hosting this event. I'm gonna just jump right in. I'll share my screen and go through some images and talk about our work. And then I'm looking forward to this conversation. So let me press all the buttons so that I can have everything up and ready. How are we looking? A+? Great. Yeah, life in proximity to death. Proximity is a big word that I'm going to kind of try to unpack a bit. I'm going to speak about the End of Life project. It's more than the film, although there is a feature-length film, and I'm going to speak about my collaborators with this work. Sorry about that. I had my notes up. So the End of Life project is the result of 4 years of filming with Pavel Wojtasek, with 5 different people at various stages of the end of life. It's more than the feature-length film. There are many articulations from this work, art installations, performance work, and it also informed a studio that exists at Parsons School of Design in the MFA Transdisciplinary Design program. As I frame the project, give me 1 second. I've actually kind of eclipsed my notes. I just need 1 second to kind of clean that up. Okay. Sorry about that. As I kind of frame the project, I'm going to also introduce some of our collaborators from the work interspersed with the framing. This is Sarah Grossman, one of the 5 people from the End of Life project. Working in a participatory design-led research mode enabled us to allow for emergence. Our approach is one of not having a prescripted agenda, and for being with situations, with people, in open-ended relational experiences. Pavel and I set out the project with a couple of questions in mind, and a couple of restrictions for ourselves. The first question is, how might we learn from experiences at the end of life in a way that could lead to expanded notions of care for all stages of life and life's transitions? And the restrictions we set for ourselves was to limit our presence to being with the people experiencing the end of life. A lot of work around end-of-life experiences tend to focus on the complex ecosystems of what in the West is a rescue mentality. And we wanted to limit the scope of our presence to being with dying people for what might enter into that space, but to not marginalize or render the person experiencing the end of life as an object. Sarah. This is Doris Johnson and her son, Richard Rickaby. The 5 people that were involved in the research were not known to us beforehand. We had discussed the project with many people in advance of the work and negotiated a way forward that was very open-ended. It was an invitation to participate, not knowing where the project would end up, what kind of form it would take. Would it be a film? What kind of audience would it have? What would its point of view be? We invited collaboration in order to allow for emergence, to discover the kinds of narratives, the kinds of textures, the kinds of spaces that would emerge from their experiences, and to engage all of our collaborators as full kind of co-conspirators to negotiate these spaces, to keep in constant conversation why we were coming together and how we would be with one another. This is Karla Rothstein, who is a teacher, and I think many of the participants in some ways were teachers, even if they weren't officially teachers. Many were artists, even if they weren't sort of celebrated or officially practicing a career path as an artist, to kind of show up to participate in an ethnographic process that would unfold over time with so much uncertainty around what kinds of life events would evolve for each of their journeys with a terminal illness. Most of us will eventually evolve toward an end-of-life process in the wake of some kind of terminal illness. And usually that's going to happen in ways in which we're not really prepared for or can anticipate. This word anticipation has come up a lot recently, especially in future studies and future design, design futures and speculative design, that a lot of our whole existence is around this notion of anticipation. This leads to kind of 2 points that became really salient for our work, one being duration and time, and the other being proximity. Helen Stanton Chappell, in her book, No Place for Dying, Hospitals and Rescue, speaks about the distances that we create unconsciously or consciously that are often geographic, psychological, emotional, and physical, that have more to do with our own challenges in reckoning with our own mortality. This is Ram Dass. The notion of being present and being in close proximity with dying, to not objectify, to not create marginalization by conflating it with privacy, is very tricky territory. And we decided that we would use the medium of cinema and cinematic tropes in order to actually mediate a space so that the viewer might have the opportunity to assume a different form of proximity and duration with experiences at the end of life. And this is Matt Friedman. Matt is an artist, and we worked extensively with him, fully collaborating with people in order to enable them to share and expose not just the foibles of their illness and their medical conditions, but the way that they navigate the complex social structures that inhabit these spaces, including ways to maintain dignity, but also ways to maintain a wholeness as a human in terms of vitality. Matt was somebody who wished to continue working as an artist despite a terminal illness, and even continued to make work with us beyond the completion of our film. And I'll talk more about that participatory collaborative experience in a bit. I want to kind of first talk a little bit more about proximity and duration. Sarah Grossman is perhaps the person we spent the most time with. The first line of our film, she says, "This new book I'm working on is going to be a wowzer, if I do say so myself." Sarah was an activist and a children's book author. She was very vivacious and active until she was paralyzed almost completely by a stroke. She could only move one arm and speak and move her head a bit. She spent 3 years in that condition, and Pavel and I spent 2 of those years with her. She could no longer work as a children's book author, but the ways in which she was able to continue to create through storytelling and actually participate in telling her own story in very creative ways was enabled through our process of openness and being present. Um, on a cinematic formal level, we made a lot of choices. And I think this is kind of where we get into this question of design or matters of design. Proximity is this notion of closeness, of being close enough to really have a sense of space and a sense of someone's presence and a sense of time in a different way, which is why I think proximity and duration, proximity and formal notions of time are very connected. Proximity is also about vulnerability, about moving yourself into what might be called a sacred space. And this notion of a sacred space at the end of life is one that deserves kind of an expanded investigation or consideration. It's not to be assumed. It's not to be assumed that sacred space of dying is the last days or minutes. Many people are in a process of dying for many years. The ways in which a sacred space might be considered during a more expansive journey at the end of life is not a question most people ask. I usually start out in our graduate studio asking my students, do you think about the end of your life as if I die or when I die? These small nuances become very profound in terms of, again, the distances that we might create in light of mortality. In order to begin this work, Pavel and I knew before we could be in these spaces and before we could understand this notion of proximity and duration, that we had to understand what experiences at the end of life might be. And by putting ourselves into what potentially are sacred spaces, how might our participation be alive and demanded in ways beyond being researchers or filmmakers? So we studied to be end-of-life doulas. We studied with Henry Frisco Weiss, who recently wrote a book called Caring for Dying. It's about the approach of an end-of-life doula. And Henry's a very interesting man in that he had volunteered as a hospice worker for 10 years. And while he appreciates and celebrates the benefits of hospice, during that experience, he also noticed gaps in that service, that there were other things that could be tended to in terms of being with dying. And from that notion, he went on to study as a birth doula because he could see the similarities of this kind of role. There are many players in an ecosystem that surround the dying person and a dying situation. Many agendas of these players, and they can all be very benevolent and generous and important. But often what gets lost is the nuance of what someone's experience is and what someone's wishes are, not in terms of how they wish to die, but in terms of how they wish to live at the end of life. Some of these things might be as minute as what I smell, what I hear, what I see. But before even considering the last minutes or hours of life, when we consider dying as potentially weeks, months, even years, the way in which we spend our time, the way in which our wishes are understood and honored and celebrated and participated in by those surrounding us can be topics that are extremely difficult to broach. The work of the doula involves kind of creative or co-creative participation in those spaces, or that kind of expansive definition of a sacred space, with the dying person, but also with their loved ones and ecosystem. Hence, this notion of proximity, I think, is a really interesting one in terms of, life in proximity to death, life in proximity to dying, and a question of design. In the West, where rescue mentality often eclipses our capacity to recognize this part of life, to celebrate it and to actually participate in the value that's present. So this notion of duration is the other kind of point I want to make before I just quickly show some of the work that we do at the studio. We worked with Ram Dass, who's a spiritual teacher. He's pretty well known to many folks. In the film, we actually do not give any context to our characters. We present them in situ, if you will. We present them in ways where they're able to share with a film audience the same kind of presence that we as the filmmakers and the researchers inhabited in order to be with them. And you know, Ram Dass is somebody who's been in front of a camera a number of times. He's written a stack of books. He has literally written the book on being present, Be Here Now. You know, and to many, not to all, especially in not other parts of the world, he's well known. It's been interesting to show the film in other parts of the world where people have no idea, and they say, you know, who's the guy with the Band-Aid on his nose? They don't understand who he might be until the final end credits come up. You know, but in working with Ram Dass, we did something super interesting in that, again, we didn't want him to be a talking head and speak to us. We wanted him to somehow be with us, to be present, and to share a more embodied, visceral experience of approaching notions of our own mortality, to enter a sacred space, to be present in ways that allowed us to reflect on our own senses, our own body, and our own consciousness of our own mortality. In that way, we were attempting the film to kind of mediate that kind of experience with all of the characters. But I believe that it was Ram Dass as a spiritual teacher, and his willingness to very creatively collaborate with us that kind of became the Rosetta Stone in terms of how the film functions as a piece of design within a greater arc of a transformational effort. We asked Ram Dass to take us on a journey from a place of fear and anxiety around dying to a place of grace or peace. And we asked him to potentially do that by either using words or not using words. And for those who have seen the film, or perhaps who might see the film, it's a very unique experimental experience with Ram Dass. He is silent for 7 minutes and basically is staring, as you see in this image, about to say something. And this goes on for 7 minutes, which becomes more than 7 minutes. It becomes a space that for some is uncomfortable, for some is mysterious, for some is infuriating, and for others is liberating. Again, going back to that notion of anticipation, duration and stillness, and an invitation into a sacred space is something that usually comes from a place of disruption from our usual modes of being in our productive day-to-day world. And through that silence, Ram Dass invites us into another way of being. Similarly, our work with Matt Friedman, the artist, took on proportions of experimentation, side projects, short films, installations, performance pieces. He was very committed to kind of a fearless sharing around his mortality, around the ways in which he had to navigate a terminal illness, his own relationship to those narratives. These are some of the performances and work we did with Matt. The film End of Life was finished in 2017, and we continued to work with him even up until the last months. We were still doing even online performances and installation work. This is from 2 weeks ago, and we were working with Matt in virtual reality when he was kind of no longer capable of some of the more physical performances, and he was making drawings, and we were planning kind of a virtual performance. We unfortunately had to say goodbye to Matt on Saturday, and this is from yesterday, from Greenwood Cemetery. After many, many years of collaborating with Matt Friedman, his casket was adorned with a Tibetan flag made out of some drawings that he had made for one of our first installation and gallery pieces in Los Angeles, curated by Equitable Vitrines. And there you see him with his family surrounding him, his brothers, and his 95-year-old mother. So let me just wrap up and talk briefly about our studio work at Parsons. I've worked with colleagues for many years. Patty Byrne, who was the Design Innovation Group creative director at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Eduardo Stozowski, who's another colleague who runs the Desis Lab at Parsons. Sam Haddix, who is an alumni of the program and now faculty. Recently also trained at the Zen Center for Contemplative Care. We've been running the studio in the MFA Transdisciplinary Design program called Design for Living and Dying. There's a website with some of the work. Here you see us working with some of the media from my field work. There you see Carol. There you actually see Matt Friedman participating in some of our studio work. We deconstruct some of the raw data from the hundreds of hours from our field work. We work with multi-stakeholder workshops where we bring together oncologists, nurse practitioners, family and friends, behavioral psychologists, hospice workers, doulas, family members, and some of the student work that has come out of the studio over the years, again, is on the website, designforlivinganddying.com. This piece is called Poetics of Dying, where students actually worked with young medical students, role-playing and recording how they're being trained to deliver news of terminal illness with patients, and then coding those scripts and looking at the ways in which language plays out. How many times did they say the word option? How many times did they say this word? And then kind of playing these videos back to them in these scripts as an act of reflection. Another project called Tibby is a doll that dies. It's actually 6 dolls. One of them dies, but the other dolls represent different phases of life and life's transitions. A project called Leave a Message, which was inspired by a project in Japan that was like a phone booth where you could call people that weren't there. This project actually addressed cognitive impairment, not even necessarily end of life, and ways in which celebrating what emerges in these kind of temporal poetics at the end of life, and the ways in which we shouldn't be trying to drag people back to some kind of normalcy, but rather meeting them in these creative spaces and celebrating these non-sequential ways in which, while the external world might get smaller, the internal world is blossoming and getting larger. This is an installation around vigil planning. A vigil plan is something that a doula might do co-creatively with a person at the end of their life or experiencing an end of life stage. They might even include family and friends and loved ones. And it's basically, you know, how do I want those days and hours to be managed in terms of my wishes and what might be a good death for me? And sharing this in a way so that those around me know how to behave or can actually participate and contribute in ways that are productive folks sometimes around dying people actually don't know what to do, and that nervous energy causes them to do all sorts of things, like, you know, trying to force feed people or saying crazy things like, if you just get up and walk around, you'd feel so much better. This installation was super powerful in that the students kind of recorded their own visual plans and made a kind of a supercut video and had an installation inviting people into this exercise. And it is an exercise when you're trained as an end-of-life doula that they asked you to do. They asked you to write your own visual plan in terms of, if I were to die in 3 months, you know, how would I kind of prescribe a best case scenario in terms of my own comfort, my own dignity, my own wishes. So lastly, I'm going to close. I'm going to show a brief 2-minute clip from the film End of Life, co-directed by Pavel Wojtasek. This is Sarah Grossman, one of the 5 people from the film. And the last thing I'll share, I'm going to let Sarah have the last word. I'll just share one more thing before I play the clip, which is, you know, through the many years of this work, people often ask me, you know, what are some of the biggest things you've learned from these experiences, from spending so much time with dying people? And what I've learned many, many things, but I feel like what I've learned the most is that often people they are reduced to bodies that need to be tended to. Their social exchange is reduced to these very talented and generous and gracious and brilliant people who are serving them in terms of medical care, health care, administering medicines, conducting procedures and tests, feeding and bathing, tending to, extremely important work, but their interaction is sometimes limited to that kind of human interaction or visits from their loved ones, which again, despite how really gracious they might be, and loving and generous and giving, there's often a patina that adheres to those spaces and exchanges that has clinging to it a sense of mourning or loss, because these people no longer serve in a certain role or function, and the memory of that being lost is hard to shake. What Pavel and I learned, because we did not know these people, we formed new relationships with them, and we could show up in these spaces, be present with them, and say, what might we do today? How might we be together? And allowing them to exercise or participate in their humanity, in their vitality, in their creativity, in whatever ways they wished to. And for that to be celebrated and meaningful, because there's tremendous value in all stages of life, and especially in this stage of life, which is often eclipsed, especially in the West, especially in the United States, through a rescue philosophy. I think I'm gonna leave Sarah with these last words.
Creating this kept me from insanity in the nursing home. Believe me, it isn't nursing, and it's not home. So that's why we're trying to think, do we want to spend our last years of life in California or New York or Massachusetts? You should think about it before it overtakes you, and suddenly you have to go into a place that you haven't examined. And it can be like a prison in terms of slapping you and things like that, and completely ignoring your wishes. It's terrifying. But the boys were stuck with us suddenly. They did the best they could. also act before it's suddenly there you are, you're 75 and you have no place to go. So if you look ahead, you can avoid that. For rich people, it's no problem. But for your type, it will be quite a difficulty finding. You have to go in the morning at breakfast time to stay the day and see what they do, whether they actually do encourage creative activity or that's just catalog talk, you know. Being in the middle of it, I can't tell you strongly enough that you and your pets and your children have to be welcome there. Thank you for your help.
Thank you. Namaste. I'll leave it there.
John,
I'll
Bruce, thank you
stop
so much.
sharing my screen. If I can get my cursor to behave.
That's all right. You can leave it there. John, as you know, I saw your wonderful and powerful film, and Sarah has, I don't know, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago I saw it, and she has stuck with me. I mean, I don't know if you think of her this way, but I really thought of her as the heart of your film. And that clip is just so powerful. It sort of says it all. She just manages to say so much. And I want to I hope we can get to sort of what she's alluding to about the democratization of death and socioeconomic status. But I want to just first ask both of you, it's interesting you both used the word patina at some point. And I had been thinking about this, about, you know, you're both talking about death design in both personal and individual ways, like with John talking about, you know, vigil plans, and Karla in very public ways that also can be very intimate. And to design death is, by definition, requires us to pay attention to what, as I think you probably both said, something we aren't especially keen to do in this country, in this culture. And I think COVID gets all mixed up in this, because in a way we're really confronting death, but we're limited often in how many of us can go to funerals and memorial services, and we're limited in terms of death vigils too. And I'm wondering if you will have thoughts about either just in general, this sort of patina of responsibility that Karla talked about, and John, you're talking about a patina as well, about sort of paying attention to these issues. And, you know, we talk a lot about being death positive, but in your discussions, in your work around this, do you see, is it a slow shift? Has COVID interrupted this shift, or is it helping accelerate it?
I think that that change, you know, we have had to make changes because of the crisis that we're in the midst of. And I think that that will only foster more change. The kinds of advancements that we are part of were already underway before COVID. And I think that, you know, the kind of distillation of the funeral, while it's been difficult because we haven't been able to engage in rituals that are comforting, also has allowed, I mean, that distillation process means that the things that are most important come to the forefront, and communication and space for emotion and sharing, those aspects of the funeral are something that I think people will continue to desire and want structures that support, and that maybe some of the more resource consumptive attributes won't have to return in the ways that they have been in the past. So, you know, it's a difficult time, but I do think that these difficulties make us more aware that you have to be willing to be uncomfortable in order to be aware. And that was something actually in John's film, which I had the privilege of seeing the full version. It's a difficult film to watch, even if one is engaged in aspects of death and dying. Acoustically at times, the pace of the film, and I wonder, because I think that this kind of disquiet or discomfort is important in terms of the space and time necessary for awareness, how that figured in your editing and production of the film.
Thank you both for your questions, and I'll just share with you that I actually have this like super formal, you know, kind of paper written that then I realized I couldn't read when I was sharing my screen, and I realized I just wanted to talk anyway because I'm actually still kind of undone by my last 2 weeks with Matt Friedman and his death on Saturday and his memorial yesterday. So thank you for indulging my casualness. I looked at the document anyway, and I was like, oh my God, I can't read this right now. But I'm actually grateful to be having this event right now, and especially be here with you, Karla, because of yesterday's memorial. It's not the kind of work I do, and it's the kind of work that you do in what happens when we die and then what. And it was just this kind of intense coincidence that, you know, there I was at this memorial. Matt Friedman was the last living interlocutor of this. You know, we've been at this for almost a decade. We started this work in 2011. We started the test shoots in 2012. We were shooting in earnest in 2013. We cut the film in 2006. It's been a long journey. But to go back to your question around kind of the challenges of the spaces of the end of life, and the ways in which there's and some of the images you shared that were absolutely like, they just, even in their renderings, exuded like peace and kind of a tranquility and a kind of a calm. You know, Ram Dass has a saying that it's like dying is like taking off a tight shoe. You know, and his guru, the Maharaji, said, you know, it's what you know, dropping the body, the soul drops the body. So I guess that there can be a difficultness, a cacophony, even a challenge in the spaces of dying that are important to be with and not erase or hide. But certainly, you know, for those of us who go on living and who have lost, to transition into a kind of a memorial space or these other places that honor, that are full of this peace, become this really interesting contrast. And that was on my mind thinking about your work, and also that's why, and like this afternoon, I included the picture of Matt's casket with the Tibetan flags, and it's not something I can speak, you know, intelligently or scholarly around in terms of what happens when we die and how we memorialize.
Let me ask you both about democratizing death, and you know, Susan talks about it. I didn't realize you were playing that clip, and I'm so glad you did, because she talks about, you know, how different it is if you have money and if you have choices, and we know how much conventional funerals cost, and that even less conventional or the traditional ways we once did funeral, natural burials are not cheap. And I don't, you know, Karla, I don't know, and I don't know if you know yet about sort of, you know, how this is going to play out in design in terms of costs for people, but how do you see your work helping democratize, equalize death in better ways? Yeah, I mean, we named the exhibition Democratizing Death intentionally. It is for sure an intention of the project, that through this, it's a reminder that we cannot take democracy lightly, that it requires work to be fulfilled, and that our mortality and decency should unite us. So it is very much our aspiration that these spaces be truly civic spaces, inclusive spaces, open spaces, and provide, you know, bridges and networks that help heal, period, but heal also the kinds of divides that are increasing or have increased in recent years for sure in our culture. Specific to the financing, you know, I've been thinking about the scales of the project. So we see it as being able to be scaled, meaning that there could be relatively small clusters that are more localized and very kind of neighborhood based. And then of course there can be much larger collective, demonstrative memorial spaces. And there are precedents for this in New York for sure. You know, if you think about the Vessel or Pier 55 or the High Line, where, you know, there are large public-private partnerships that produce spaces. And obviously, you know, we could go on in a different forum at length about how successful each of those and others are. But I think that conjunction of understanding that that death and the spaces of death deserve and should provide dignity and respect across all individuals' identities and groups is extremely important, and that it isn't that they are civic spaces, meaning that there should also be an amount of public funding that goes into their realization.
One of the last images that you shared, Karla, that beautiful rendering of that civic space really struck a chord with me in terms of, you know, this notion of like bringing kind of a transparency to mortality into the social fabric and into the everyday. And I do think that has an impact on then what might occur in these spaces of end of life. You know, Ram Dass had this grand idea, and he actually has a business partner on Maui, who they wanted to recreate Varanasi on Maui. They wanted to have a public crematorium that was behind a glass wall, that there was this, again, transparency of like, how are we, not, again, creating a distance around mortality that when it's invisible or hidden, except for when you're in the throes of either dealing with dying or dealing with memorializing a loved one, or dealing with, you know, the ways in which we treat the dead. You know, it doesn't serve. It doesn't serve us. So it's just like through creating a transparency, you know, again, to get at the economics, who's going to pay for this? But it has to be kind of a value of a part of life. Otherwise, it's just going to be this hot potato. And Sarah, when she says, you know, for rich people, it's no problem, but for your type, it will be quite difficult. She's talking to me. She's saying like, well, you're an artist, you know, and you're not rich. You know, I think that it's not only like what the cost of a burial or memorial might be, but it's you know, when we're no longer productive, when we're no longer working, and in our United States of America that does not honor healthcare as a right, and that people go bankrupt from a serious illness, let alone a terminal illness. This is, I think, the biggest criminal infraction on decency and a modern society.
So I want to quickly, since we don't have a lot of time, I want to get to, there's some really good questions in the Q&A. And so we may have to plow through so I can ask more than one, but somebody, and this is moderator's bias here because it's something I care about a lot, throughout human history, somebody says, caring for our dead has been a core part of what it is to be human. Only recently has this been outsourced to professionals in a commercial industry. What opportunities do you envision for hands-on family and community involvement in the alternative disposition methods of the future? Is there any reason that you can't still care for your dead at home and then use?
There's no reason. I mean, if one wants to and is, and the circumstances allow it, you know, the dead can certainly be cared for in the home by the family. And there's nothing that would mean that corpse, and that unembalmed natural corpse couldn't then be brought to a space where the afterlife process can be utilized. So, I mean, we very much, I hope it comes across in the images, imagine that the family is there and part of the process. This is not a kind of back of house idea. It's intended to be public facing, respectful, dignified, but something that one encounters whether you are the family of the deceased or not, and that engagement with death, with our own mortality, and with spaces to grieve not only individual but also collective losses of many, you know, definitions and durations, right? Grief is not only associated, and loss is not only associated with death, and so, yeah, I mean, we definitely would want people to care for their dead in the ways that they are most comfortable. An embalmed corpse, you know, wouldn't likely work because of the chemicals.
Right. I want to get to this because it's a really great question. So somebody says, during a recent discussion at the Funeral Consumers Alliance conference on histories of Black undertaking, an attendee brought up low rates of green burials and cremation in African-American communities. This keynote speaker, Dr. Cami Fletcher, spoke of how these options exist in tension with the ethos of many African-American funerary practices, where dignity and material care were and are extended to the dead during a grand funeral. That's not possible in life, in ways that are not possible in life due to systemic inequality and racialized violence. So the question is, how might the design of new spaces and practices around death possibly undercut the meaningful death rituals and practices of historically marginalized communities? While design and environment shape culture imaginations around death, how do you approach and mitigate the possibility that design might enact a symbolic violence on communities and their death ways?
I mean, what I certainly would say at the top of the response would be that we have no desire to take away options from anyone. We simply believe that alternatives are desirable for some, and that providing new options at death that are commensurate with the values that some people prioritize today, is providing a service. So so that's important to me to convey. Like, it's not our agenda at all to undercut anyone's choice. We're looking to augment and amplify choice. I would hope, I guess, that these spaces feel open to diverse rituals and priorities. So, you know, the ceremony that can attend the disposition of a body is personal, and you know, we're not looking to circumscribe what one can or cannot do at death. I mean, as I say, from an organic standpoint, embalming is something that I think would be ruled out. But that doesn't mean there can't be an open casket. That doesn't mean that, you know, that the deceased can't be celebrated prior to disposition. So I hope that answers.
Yep. Thank you. John, do you want to have the last word with a minute left on that, or?
You know, it's funny showing the film in different parts of the world, and I have a co-producer who's Greek. We did the post-production of the film in Greece, and when we showed the film in Greece, people were looking at it going like, "Where are these people?" You know, they didn't understand like why there weren't scenes, you know, more scenes, especially of people closer to the end of life in their homes. So the discussion became this different thing, because to them that was like the place of saying like, what is this? And Athena Sangare, one of the producers who was there, said, well, you know, for us in Greece, this is a cautionary tale that if we give up some of our cultural rituals of how we address death and dying, we might lose the tradition and the capacities to care in different ways. And I thought that was really profound.
Yeah, yeah. Before we close it out, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew, but I really want to say, Karla and John, thank you so very much. Your work is so important, and it's a great complement to each other. And it was just a thrill to be able to moderate this talk with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Maggie, thank you so much for moderating and chairing this evening, and thanks again to Karla and John for these really stimulating presentations and the discussion to follow. As I mentioned at the outset, you know, this was an event that we had planned, you know, probably about a year ago when we first got started and had it set up for March. And I think the quote that Karla shared about the urgency of crises is a really good one to reflect upon, as of course not only New York City but the entire world is facing this crisis, and hopefully a series of opportunities on a number of different fronts to kind of rethink the ways in which we connect, the ways in which we care for one another, and the kinds of things we value. So I want to thank all of the attendees as well for coming along. And as Karla had mentioned, some of the folks from Reimagine, it was fantastic to be able to link up with the Reimagine project based out of San Francisco. Let me just say finally before ending, this last question of inequalities and issues of race are going to be addressed more directly in an event that we have planned for November 17th, when my colleague Yosef Soret will be chairing a discussion that we're hosting called Life After Death in Black America. This was also an event that was scheduled to take place last spring, which was now rescheduled, and will no doubt be shaped by the resonances not only of COVID and the recent upsurge of interest and attention to Black Lives Matter, but of course the pending election next week. So I hope you can join us all for that event on, I believe it's November 17th. Thank you all again for joining us, and apologies to those of you whose questions we didn't get to, but we really do appreciate you all joining us this evening. Thank you.